There is a program running in your mind right now, and you did not write most of its code. Somebody else did. A tired teacher who told you to be realistic. A parent who meant well but taught you to expect less. A failure from 6 years ago that you replay more often than you replay your own name. And tonight, in the next 30 minutes, before you turn off the light and let your mind slip into that strange, unguarded state between waking and sleep, you are going to get the chance to overwrite one line of that code. Just one line. That is all it takes to begin bending the direction of an entire life. Maybe you already sense that something in you is capable of more than what your current circumstances reflect. Maybe you have felt it in the quiet moments, driving home in silence, staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, scrolling past someone else's success, and feeling that strange, uncomfortable mixture of inspiration and ache. Perhaps right now you are working harder than almost everyone you know, and yet the results refuse to match the effort. You wake up early, you read the books, you watch the videos, you make the lists, and still, some invisible ceiling seems to sit 6 inches above your head, no matter how high you reach, no matter how many times you tell yourself this year will be different. Maybe you have started to quietly wonder if the problem is you, if you are simply not one of the lucky ones. If success is a room other people were let into before the doors closed, and you arrived just late enough to watch it lock. You tell yourself you will try again tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes a pattern, and the pattern hardens into an identity, and slowly, without ever making a conscious decision about it, you stop expecting the life you once imagined for yourself. You do not say this out loud. You would never admit it to anyone, maybe not even to yourself in full daylight. But there is a whisper in you on certain nights that says maybe this ordinary, unremarkable stretch of years is simply what your life is going to be. Maybe the dream you carried at 20 was just a young person's naivety. And this, right here, is what growing up actually looks like. Maybe you've even built a quiet case for why this makes sense, why it isn't really your fault, why the odds were simply stacked against someone like you from the start. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Some of that case might even be true. The world is not always fair. Some people really did start further ahead. But building a strong case for staying stuck has never once, in the history of any person who has ever lived, actually gotten anyone unstuck. You can be right about the unfairness and still be the only one paying the price for staying still. Somewhere inside you, underneath the exhaustion and the disappointment, there is still a version of you that has not fully given up, or you would not still be watching a video with a title like this one at this hour of the night. I want you to hear this clearly because it matters more than almost anything else I will say tonight. That whisper is not the truth. It is a thought that got planted, and thoughts that get planted grow. Nearly a century ago, a man named Napoleon Hill spent 20 years studying the most successful people of his era, interviewing them, observing them, trying to answer one obsessive question: why do some people rise into extraordinary lives while others, working just as hard, staying up just as late, wanting it just as badly, remain exactly where they started? What he found had almost nothing to do with luck, birthright, connections, or even raw intelligence. It had to do with the mind, and specifically with what a person deliberately or accidentally plants inside it, over and over, until it takes root. Think about that for a second. Every person you admire from a distance, the ones who seem to move through the world with a kind of quiet certainty you've never quite managed to feel yourself, started somewhere close to where you are sitting right now. They doubted themselves. They lay awake some nights wondering if the whole thing was a delusion they'd talked themselves into. The difference was never the absence of doubt. The difference was what they did with the doubt, and more specifically, what they chose to plant on top of it, night after night, until the doubt was simply outgrown rather than defeated in some single dramatic battle. Nobody defeats self-doubt in one conversation. People outgrow it slowly, the way a garden outgrows weeds when something stronger is planted deliberately alongside them and tended with more consistency than the weeds ever received. Tonight, we are going to walk through the principles Hill uncovered across those 2 decades of research, and by the end, you are going to know exactly what to plant in your mind before you sleep tonight, and why that single, small, private act, repeated with patience, can begin to change the trajectory of your entire life. Let's start with the foundation, because without it, nothing else in this video will work for you. Hill called it definiteness of purpose, and it is far more demanding than the vague, comfortable version of goal setting we've all been sold by motivational posters and productivity apps. Most people walk through life carrying a wish rather than a purpose. I want to be successful. I want more money. I want to be happy someday. A wish is soft. A wish asks nothing of you and demands nothing of the world in return. And so, unsurprisingly, it receives nothing in return either. A definite purpose is sharp. It has a shape you could describe to a stranger in one sentence. It has a deadline. And underneath it, it has a reason burning hot enough to keep you moving on the days when you don't feel like moving at all, because there will be many of those days, and feeling like it was never the requirement. Henry Ford did not wish for a car that ordinary families could afford. He fixed his mind on one exact outcome: a reliable, affordable automobile built for the common working man, not just the wealthy few. And he held that image so completely, so stubbornly, that when his own engineers told him the engine he wanted was mechanically impossible to build, he simply refused to accept their answer. He kept them working on it for months, past the point where any reasonable business owner would have cut his losses, because in his mind, the finished machine already existed. He wasn't hoping it might exist someday. He was, in a strange but very real sense, simply waiting for reality to catch up to the picture already burned into his imagination. That is the difference between a wish and a purpose. A wish waits politely for permission. A purpose does not ask for any. Here is where most people quietly disqualify themselves before they've even started, and I want to gently pull you back from doing the same thing to yourself tonight. They believe they need to already know their life's grand, sweeping purpose before they're allowed to begin, some cinematic, poetic mission handed down from the heavens, fully formed. That is not what Hill's research actually showed, and it is not what anyone who has built something extraordinary will tell you when they're being honest instead of quotable. Purpose does not have to be poetic. It has to be precise. Ask yourself honestly, could you write down right now in one clean sentence exactly what you are working toward and exactly when you expect to have it? Most people, if they're truthful, cannot. They can describe a general direction. They can tell you they want to be doing better a year from now. But a general direction is not a purpose, and it never produces the kind of urgency that a specific, dated, describable outcome produces. Vague goals allow for vague effort, and vague effort, given enough time, always drifts back toward whatever is easiest. Definiteness closes that escape hatch. It is much harder to quietly abandon something you've written down in specific, measurable terms than something you've only ever felt in general terms. Tonight, before you sleep, I want you to name one specific outcome you are moving toward in the next 90 days. Not a feeling, a fact, a number, a date, a finished, describable thing. Write it down in a single sentence and read it to yourself in the last minute before your eyes close. That is your action step tonight, and it will cost you less than 2 minutes of your time. Now let's talk about the principle this entire video is quietly built around, because it is the one most people underestimate the most: autosuggestion. This is the deliberate, repeated act of feeding your own subconscious mind a chosen idea until it accepts that idea as fact. Most people assume their beliefs about themselves are fixed, carved into stone somewhere deep and unreachable. They are not. They are simply the ideas that got repeated to you the most times by other people or by your own inner voice, until your mind stopped questioning them and started defending them like they were sacred. Here is the myth-busting moment, because I think you need to hear it plainly without softening. Most people believe confidence has to come first and action comes second, that you need to feel ready before you're allowed to move. Hill's research told a very different story. He found that the successful men he studied did not sit around waiting to feel confident before they acted. They repeated deliberate statements of belief to themselves quietly, privately, often in the exact minutes before falling asleep, until the feeling of confidence finally arrived as a consequence of the repetition, not as a precondition for it. The mind doesn't refuse orders. It just executes them. If you tell it, day after day, night after night, that you are slow, that you are unlucky, that good things happen to other people but never quite to you, it will not argue with that instruction. It will simply go to work quietly proving you right, because that is its only job. It doesn't judge the instruction for accuracy. It only carries it out, faithfully without complaint. This is precisely why the state right before sleep matters so much, and why this video's title is not just a clever hook. In those final drowsy minutes, your conscious, critical, argumentative mind goes quiet, and your subconscious mind becomes unusually receptive, like soil that has just been turned over and left open, ready to receive whatever seed happens to fall into it that night. Think about what you actually plant most nights without realizing it. The unanswered message you're anxious about, the comment that stung earlier in the day, the number in your bank account that felt too small again. None of that is neutral. All of it is instruction delivered straight to the part of your mind with the least ability to argue back and the strongest ability to act on what it receives. Whatever you plant before you sleep, you harvest by morning. Not literally overnight, of course, but in the slow, compounding, almost invisible way that repeated thought eventually becomes belief, and belief eventually becomes behavior, and behavior sustained long enough eventually becomes an entire life. Tonight's action step is simple. Choose one sentence, present tense, personal, specific, something like I follow through on what I start, or I am the kind of person opportunities find. Say it slowly, several times, in the final 60 seconds before your eyes close. Do this every single night for 30 days without skipping, and quietly watch what begins to shift in how you move through your ordinary days. Let's move to the subconscious mind itself, because autosuggestion is only the delivery method. The subconscious is the actual destination, and understanding how it really works will change how seriously you take these small, unglamorous nightly rituals. Your subconscious does not distinguish especially well between a vividly imagined experience and an actually lived one. This is not mysticism. It is simply how the mind processes repeated, emotionally charged imagery over time. Athletes have leaned on this for decades, mentally rehearsing a perfect performance so many times in such vivid detail that their bodies eventually respond to the moment as memory rather than as fantasy. You are already programming yourself every single day, whether you intend to or not. The only real question is who's currently holding the keyboard. Thomas Edison offers one of the clearest examples of this principle in action that we have on record. After thousands of failed attempts to create a working filament for the electric light bulb, a reporter reportedly asked him how it felt to have failed so many times. Edison's response, paraphrased across the various accounts of those who knew him well, was that he hadn't failed at all. He had simply discovered thousands of ways that didn't work, and each one moved him one step closer to the single way that would. That is not naive optimism dressed up for a biography. That is a subconscious mind that had been so thoroughly, deliberately trained to interpret setbacks as data rather than as verdicts, that failure had lost nearly all of its emotional sting. He did not have to talk himself into that calm response in the moment of the interview. It was already the quiet belief running underneath everything he did, planted there through years of deliberate self-direction, watered on purpose, night after night, until it simply became who he was. Your action step tonight is to take one recent setback, something small is fine, and consciously reframe it out loud if you're willing, as information rather than as a judgment on your worth. Say plainly what it taught you. Then, and this part matters just as much, let it go. Before we move forward, let me ask you something plainly. When was the last time you actually paid attention to what you were thinking about in the 10 minutes before sleep? Most people couldn't tell you. It happens on autopilot, the mind wandering wherever the day's residue happens to pull it, usually toward whatever felt unresolved, embarrassing, or frightening. That default setting is not neutral, and it was never designed with your future in mind. It is simply the path of least resistance for a tired brain at the end of a long day. Reclaiming those minutes on purpose, even just for one sentence, is a small act of authorship over a part of your life you've probably been letting run on default for years without ever questioning it. Now, imagination, and I want to be careful here because Hill did not simply mean daydreaming or wishful thinking. He drew a firm, deliberate line between what he called synthetic imagination, which rearranges existing ideas into new and useful combinations, and creative imagination, which reaches for something closer to genuine original insight, often arriving in those same quiet, relaxed, half-asleep states we've been discussing all along. Andrew Carnegie did not invent steel. What he did was imagine an entirely new way of organizing the people and processes surrounding steel production, combining ideas that already existed separately in manufacturing, transportation, and labor management into a structure no one had quite assembled that way before. He then deliberately surrounded himself with a small circle of specialists sharper than himself in each individual domain, a practice Hill would later name the mastermind principle, and let their combined thinking accomplish what no single person, including Carnegie himself, could ever have built alone. Imagination, in this sense, is not about pulling brand new thoughts out of thin air. It is about giving yourself honest permission to combine what you already know and who you already know in a way you simply haven't tried yet. Tonight's action step: take a problem you felt stuck on for a while, and instead of attacking it head on again, ask yourself what two unrelated skills, ideas, or people you already have access to might combine to create an unexpected third option you haven't considered. Before we talk about persistence, there is one more principle that quietly makes everything else possible, and Hill considered it powerful enough to build an entire framework around: the mastermind. This is not some mystical concept, despite the name. It simply means the coordinated effort of two or more minds working toward a definite purpose in a spirit of genuine harmony. Hill observed that no person in his research had ever built something extraordinary entirely alone, no matter how the story got simplified afterward for the sake of a tidy biography. Carnegie's steel empire was never really a one-man achievement, and neither was Ford's automobile company. Behind every name we remember was a small circle of minds thinking together, each person supplying something the others lacked. Here is the myth worth busting on this one, too. Most people believe asking for help is a quiet admission of weakness, a signal that they couldn't figure it out alone. Hill's research suggested almost the opposite. The people who rose the fastest were the ones humble enough to recognize the limits of a single mind working in isolation, and confident enough to actively seek out others who saw what they could not yet see. Two minds combined, thinking together toward the same purpose, do not simply add their thinking together. Something closer to multiplication happens, a third intelligence emerging from the exchange that neither person could have produced sitting alone in a quiet room. Your action step tonight is to think of one person in your life, even someone you haven't spoken to in a while, who believes in the same kind of future you're quietly working toward. Reach out to them this week, not for a favor, for a conversation. You would be surprised how many extraordinary things began as nothing more than two tired people admitting to each other honestly that they wanted more. We need to talk about persistence now, because honestly, everything we've covered so far will quietly collapse without it. Here is something uncomfortable that almost nobody says out loud on this kind of channel. The idea itself does not work instantly. The belief itself does not work instantly. The purpose itself does not work instantly. There is almost always a long, unglamorous stretch where you have done everything right, everything we've just discussed, and the results still refuse to show up on schedule. This is exactly where most people quit, at the precise moment they are, statistically and historically, closest to the shift finally arriving. Rockefeller, long before he became one of the wealthiest men in American history, spent years buried in unglamorous, tedious bookkeeping work, refining an almost obsessive discipline around tracking every single cent, long before the opportunities that eventually made him famous ever appeared on his horizon. He was not persistent because he could already clearly see the outcome ahead of him. He was persistent because he had trained himself, through small, repeated, boring decisions, to keep functioning at a high standard regardless of whether anyone was watching or rewarding him for it yet. Persistence is not a personality trait some people are simply born with and others aren't. Hill was explicit about this in his research. It is a habit built the exact same way any habit is built, through repetition, until continuing on becomes more automatic than quitting ever was. Your action step tonight is deliberately small. Choose the task you've been most tempted to abandon this week and commit to doing just the next 5 minutes of it. Nothing more required, nothing more asked of you. Momentum, not motivation, is what actually carries people through the middle of anything worthwhile. Notice something about every principle we've covered so far. None of them are dramatic. None of them require you to quit your job tomorrow, move to a new city, or become a different person overnight. They are all small, almost boring, endlessly repeatable actions, a written sentence, a reframed setback, a 5 minute effort, a single reconnection with an old friend. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a limitation of this video. It is the entire secret hiding in plain sight. The people we remember as extraordinary were not extraordinary in their methods. They were extraordinary in their willingness to repeat unremarkable actions long after everyone else had quietly stopped. There's a decision buried inside everything we've just walked through, and I don't want you to miss it, because it is the hinge the rest of your life quietly swings on. Hill found something striking when he compared the wealthiest, most accomplished people of his era to those who never quite arrived where they hoped to. The successful ones tended to make decisions quickly and change them slowly, while everyone else made decisions slowly and changed them constantly, second-guessing themselves into a kind of permanent, exhausting stillness. Indecision feels safe because it protects you from ever being wrong, but it also quietly protects you from ever being right, from ever moving, from ever finding out what you were actually capable of all along. Every single night you spend deciding tomorrow, deciding next month, deciding once things finally settle down, is another night that invisible ceiling stays exactly where it was yesterday. I want to be honest with you for a moment because I think you've earned that after sitting with me this long into the video. I did not always believe any of this myself. There was a version of me that quietly thought self-improvement content like this was little more than comforting noise, designed for people too afraid to admit their circumstances were simply unfair, too soft to face reality as it actually was. I had my own nights where I planted nothing on purpose, where I let the day's failures replay uninterrupted in the dark until I finally fell asleep exhausted by my own mind, rather than at peace with it. I remember counting the ways things had gone wrong the way other people count sheep, and calling it realism, because it felt safer than calling it what it actually was. What changed for me was not one single dramatic moment, no lightning bolt, no cinematic turning point you could put in a highlight reel. It was one ordinary night, not particularly different from any other, where I simply got tired of losing to my own thoughts without putting up any kind of fight at all. I picked one sentence. I said it to myself, quietly in the dark, feeling more than a little foolish saying it out loud to an empty room. Nothing happened that night. Nothing happened the next night either. I want to be honest about that too, because I think too much of this kind of content promises an overnight shift that never actually arrives. And then people quit on night 4 feeling foolish for having tried it all. But I kept doing it anyway, not because I believed it yet, but honestly because I had run out of better ideas to try. And somewhere around the third or fourth week, without any single moment I could point to and call the turning point, I noticed I was making a decision slightly faster than I used to. Then I noticed I was giving up on a task slightly less often. Small things, almost embarrassingly small, but small things repeated are the only kind of large thing that ever actually happens in a human life. The belief came later. It always comes later. That is the part nobody tells you clearly enough. You do not need to feel ready or fully convinced before you begin. You only need to be willing to plant something before you know for certain whether it will grow. Say that back to yourself for a moment slowly. You are not broken. You are not late. You are not one of the people the good things simply skip over on their way to someone else. You are, right now, tonight, holding the exact same mental soil that every single person we've discussed in this video once held, untested, uncertain, ordinary in every visible way, before they decided what would be planted in it, on purpose, night after night. The ceiling you feel pressing above you was built the same way everything else in your mind was built. One repeated thought at a time, stacked quietly over years, and it can be rebuilt the exact same way, starting tonight, starting with one sentence, said slowly, right before your eyes finally close. Here is what I want you to remember above everything else in this video, long after you've closed the app and moved on with your evening. What the mind can hold on to and truly believe, the mind can eventually bring into being, not because thinking alone rearranges the world around you like magic, but because a mind that believes something acts differently than a mind that doubts it. And it is the acting, sustained quietly over months and years, that eventually rearranges your life piece by piece. You do not need to fix everything tonight. You do not need a new job by morning, a repaired relationship by breakfast, or a transformed bank account by the weekend. You only need to plant one true thing, tend it honestly, and refuse to dig it back up out of impatience the way you may have done a dozen times before with other efforts that never got the chance to take root. Every forest you have ever stood beneath was once a collection of seeds nobody could see yet. Give yourself the same quiet patience you would give a tree. Tonight, before you sleep, I want you to do one thing and only one thing. Choose a single sentence that describes who you are becoming, not who you currently feel like on your hardest days. Say it slowly, 5 times in the final minute before your eyes close, and mean it as much as you can manage, even if it feels a little untrue tonight. Do this again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the night after that, whether you feel like it or not, because feeling like it was never the requirement. I know how these videos usually end. A quick reminder to subscribe, a mention of the next video, and then it's gone from your mind by the time the next thing auto-plays. I don't want that for you tonight, and honestly, I don't think you came here for that either. You came here because some part of you is still listening for permission to begin again, even after everything, even after all the false starts you might be quietly ashamed of. Consider this your permission, not because I have any special authority to give it, but because the only permission that was ever actually required was your own, and you've been waiting for it far longer than you needed to. So take the next 24 hours seriously. Write the one sentence. Choose the setback to reframe. Reach out to the one person. Give the 5 minutes to the task you've been avoiding. Small as they are, do at least one of them before this day ends, so that tonight's planting has something real standing behind it instead of just words said into the dark. If you are willing to actually do this, not just nod along and forget it by morning like 100 other videos you've watched, I want you to comment one word below this video, the single word that best captures what you are committing to plant tonight. Not a sentence, not an explanation, one word. Let it be the first quiet proof that something in you has already finally started to change.